Hi everyone, BuffEnglish here. Chapter 3 in Lord of the Flies introduces something very important to us. If chapters 1 and 2 gave us a good foundation for the story, a good overview of the boys, their circumstances, and their opportunities and challenges, then chapter 3 brings us something we have to pay attention to: change. We see this with the opening descriptions of the chapter involving Jack. Jack is out in the forest alone, hunting, but he's not quite the same Jack as we met earlier. We get the idea that the boys have been on the island for a little while now, perhaps a week, and yes, many of his characteristics are still the same, but our attention is drawn toward his appearance. Now he's described like dog-like, moving shadow-like, with a sharpened stick, long hair, tattered shorts, flared nostrils, and even ape-like. He's beginning to become a true hunter, but the multiple comparisons of him to an animal, along with his clothing and hair completely changing from the cloaked choir boy we saw earlier, demonstrate a moving away from the civilized character who was guided and bounded by the expectations of society towards something else. Jack, though, is not successful at hunting, and despite throwing his spear towards a pig, his prey gets away. He then returns to the beach and finds Ralph near the lagoon, who is trying and failing to build shelters. The shelters are falling apart, and everyone except Simon has gone off to play. It's interesting to see the parallel that both Jack and Ralph began their tasks with enthusiastic help from others, but were eventually left alone and eventually fail at their desired tasks. Jack, though, seemed to prefer the solitude of hunting, while Ralph laments the laziness and short-sightedness of the boys. Ultimately, the opening of this chapter shows the furtive attempts at developing the skills, such as hunting and shelter building and the commitment to go with them, needed to build their little civilization. They're all still just kids, although there are coconuts full of fresh water set aside in the shade, so the boys are at least organized enough to think of and maintain easy access to fresh water for themselves. But Ralph does address this ultimate lack of commitment and responsibility when he says, "And they keep running off. They're off bathing or eating or playing. I bet if I blew the conch this minute, they'd come running. Then we'd be, very solemn, and someone would say we ought to build a jet or a submarine or a TV set. When the meeting was over, they'd work for 5 minutes, then wander off and go hunting." Ralph, as a leader, recognizes the fundamental shortcomings of the boys, but as a boy, he's unable to do much to fix it himself. And Jack isn't any better. In fact, he's arguably worse. In fact, one of the critiques that Ralph just levied was that when boys are lazy, they might go off and go hunting. Chapter 3 makes it monumentally obvious that Jack is solely fixated on getting meat. But who can blame him? I probably would too if all I had to eat was questionable bananas that gave me the runs. But Jack is driven by much more than the desire for meat. He tried to convey the compulsion to track down and kill that was swallowing him up. If it was hunger that drove him, we might understand that. But for Jack, there is an unutterable animal instinct for blood that sinisterly seems to drive him. We especially see this when their discussion brings up the idea of being rescued, and Jack surprisingly seems to have to remember what rescue meant. He had apparently been so obsessed with becoming a hunter. Jack is rather annoying in this chapter, as almost all he thinks about and expresses has something to do with hunting. He talks so obsessively about hunting and finding pigs instead of rescue that Ralph has to correct him. "I was talking about smoke. Don't you want to be rescued? All you can talk about is pig, pig, pig." The next part of Jack and Ralph's conversation is equally unutterable as Jack's compulsion to kill. Jack and Ralph acknowledge that there is a small but palpable fear beginning to brew amongst the children. And Simon, making his entrance to the conversation, calls it out directly. "As if," said Simon, the beastie or the snake thing was real." And then they suggest, as if this wasn't a good island, contradicting Ralph's initial assessment from chapter 2 of their island being good. And Jack confesses that when he's hunting, you can feel as if you're not hunting, but being hunted, as if something's behind you all the time in the jungle. What we want to note here is that there is no evidence at all for an actual beastie. This is only a feeling the boys have, one that we can all admit we've had when we're alone and afraid and in the dark. But there is something that does threaten the boys that we have seen emerge in the story so far. Their lack of commitment and responsibility, their disorganization, their short-sightedness, their fear, and Jack's commitment to kill. These are not necessarily the fatal evils we think of when we imagine a terrifying monster, but the irony of the boys' experiences, juxtaposed to the mention of the beastie in this chapter, make it evident to us, if not to them, what they should really be afraid of. Ralph, through this chapter, is also beginning to learn some hard lessons about mankind, and passing them on to us. He wanted to explain how people were never quite what you thought they were. The opening chapters showed the basis for a difference between Jack and Ralph, and now we see a clear divide emerging between these two characters who are beginning to serve as foils for one another. Jack is focused intently on hunting, and his train of thinking continually returns to this subject, while Ralph is focused on the signal fire and on the shelters. This represents their diverging interests, but also their diverging symbolism. As we'll talk more as the story progresses in future videos, Ralph begins to represent the idea of democratic rule and a commitment to the values of civilization, while Jack takes on the significance of a self-interested autocrat ruled by his compulsions. The restrictions of society be damned. The two boys exit the chapter, described as, "They walked along, two continents of experience and feeling, unable to communicate." But we leave Jack and Ralph and end the chapter with Simon, whom both Jack and Ralph agree is queer and funny. Simon has jet black hair, and like many other boys, has darkly burned skin, tattered clothing, and no shoes. He hands the little ones fruit from the abundant fruit trees, and an image for some reason brings to my mind Christ-like imagery of Jesus taking care of little children. He then goes off into solitude, into a tight, isolated spot in the jungle. The descriptions here at the end of the chapter become somewhat strange, and if you felt yourself a touch confused by the last paragraphs, you're not alone. The narration turns away from dialogue and action and instead becomes very sensory. We start with a description of Simon quietly trotting off to this strange space on the island, and then we're told through several paragraphs what exactly this space looks like, smells like, sounds like, and feels like, perhaps as though we are experiencing this space through Simon's perspective. It becomes a mysterious, ethereal experience as dusk settles over the island and draws the chapter to a close. We really only hear from 3 characters in this chapter, and if anything, Chapter 3 builds off of the initial divide we observed between Jack and Ralph in the previous 2 chapters, demonstrating the steady but noticeable change that is beginning to take place amongst the boys of the island. Well, make sure you stay tuned to these details as you read on, and I'll see you next for Chapter 4. See ya!